with $25 billion spent in the United States alone. Conventional disclosure laws do not apply online or are simply impossible to enforce. This kind of stealth marketing has a corrosive effect on public discourse. Institutional integrity goes out the window when editorial content adapts to advertiser demands. And I think that that is a really important conversation to be having right now. Like, being a part of Twitter now, it makes me so aware of this idea of public discourse. You can really see conversations as they're happening, but you can't see as much what you're referring to with stealth marketing. And I'm just wondering, you do work in so many different capacities. How do you insulate yourself from power that you don't want while still finding a way to expand your voice in what you're doing and like reaching more people?
Yeah, I mean that's the promise of advertisers, right? Is you kind of sign up with them, and then they will expand your voice. They'll put their machine behind you, and I'm a brat, you know. I want to be able to like reach an audience and do my work without having to partner with companies and causes I don't believe in. Thanks for reading a bit of my book. I wish I could sing Diet Coke in your song, but that would suck.
No, I love this book. It's like so, I would recommend it to everybody. It's so excellent. It just covers so much ground, and it raises so many big questions. I was talking to a friend of mine before this panel, and he was like, yeah, I read that book earlier this year, and like, I was really inspired, but I also just like, it made me feel bad because I realized how bad things really are. And I think that's like, but that's a reality that people need to wake up to, is that as a creator, you maybe can feel completely connected to your audience or your potential audience now on the internet, or maybe you see more opportunities for resources to create with, but how are we ensuring that the work that we're creating isn't just an endless stream of advertisements for products? Right. How do we ensure that like art and the creation of culture remains idea exchange rather than product placement and like furthering business venture capital?
Yeah. Well, and the mythology of your generation and my generation is that we don't care about these things anymore, right? And I think it's important to say that, you know, we've acquiesced as a society to the corporate sponsorship model. I mean, that is the entire economy of the internet, which is advertising finance. And you know, it's so retrograde. We have this amazing new communications platform, and yet we have this completely retrograde funding model. I mean, it's like the early days of television where soap operas sold soap. It's like, why can't we innovate? And that's because the economic aspects have not been disrupted. We haven't, if anything, we've shut down our minds to public options and to other ways of supporting art and culture. But I think that idea is really pervasive, that people don't care anymore. And that was one reason that I found, I think that your band struck me, and that you're a voice out there saying, no, we give a shit, you know?
No, totally. And I think that idea gets distorted because there are a number of people who care about this sort of thing tremendously, but are trying to look at it from a really pragmatic angle of like, I want to make art, I want to create things, I need money in order to do that. I'm going to take money from whoever is offering it to me, which I can really understand because I work in a restaurant. That's where I spend most of my time, and I'm often wondering, like, I'm not sitting in my restaurant wondering, like, how am I gonna become a famous star? I'm wondering, how am I gonna live a life where I can actually get paid for the work that I want to create and not, like, waste away in this industry that I don't care about, serving people food.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think for too long the conversation's been focused on individuals or bands and the choices they've made, and a lot of finger pointing instead of looking at the broader structure.
Totally.
It's like you live in a society where you let the dog park be sponsored by Purina, and where, you know, corporate sponsors get to name the auditoriums and stuff like that. So it's a structural problem, and we kind of individualize it and demonize people.
Totally.
I think as individuals, one thing we can do though is invest in institutions and scenes and local bookstores, and there are things that we can build as artists that are not just about our personal work, but contribute to a sort of broader cultural ecology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an important aspect. But yeah, it's a hard.
And I think that's one way that discourse facilitated by the internet can work to your benefit is finding like-minded people to create something larger than just your individual work, and who you can bounce ideas off of, and try to work together so that you're not feeling totally isolated in your pursuits. Because you're right, if we can find ways to invest in community-minded pursuits that we feel like we have a stake in and can affect.
Can you talk about, I just read in a little piece that Kevin sent, there was a show that you played that was sponsored by a corporate.
Yes.
Yes, and what did you do?
Yes. We played a show, it was around this time last year, there's like a CMJ week every year in New York, which is kind of like an industry sort of thing. You take your band and you're supposed to make a big scene and hopefully get discovered, I guess, is what people are trying to do with that. A friend of ours we know her, she writes for Pitchfork, invited us to come play one of their events, which was sponsored by Converse. I think we got some shoes. We didn't know when we said yes that it was sponsored by Converse, but I don't think that would have changed our decision to play the show, because we were reaching more people participating in that event, and we actually it's something that I feel like we're turning into the burrito band sometimes because everyone's still asking about it, but we made a funny joke and threw burritos at people and we're like, thank you for sponsoring the show, Chipotle, this is so great. Just to make a joke about how all of these events and everything that we do is underwritten by corporate money at this point.
Yeah, almost every stage you play on at a festival, there's some big airline or there's some
right.
Target sign.
And it's really what I return to so much right now is people who want to make work independently and aren't exclusively interested in just making as much money as possible, but just making enough to sustain themselves and do their work. If the community or industry or whatever you want to call it that we inhabit is so underwritten by these companies, how do we work outside of that without just like you said earlier, you kind of felt like a curmudgeon on an island or something writing your book. And I think a lot of times if you're saying no, this is not okay with me, you find yourself in that position. Or when you're like, hey, this sucks, I don't really like the way things are, you'll find a lot of people backing off because there's so much of this money is supporting everything that we're doing.
Yeah, I think there's lots of solace to be taken in historical lessons of people fighting for different kinds of reforms. Reading even the history of broadcast media and looking at what it took to get our little pathetic version of public broadcasting in the United States was kind of heartening. Why these voices in the wilderness shouting a non-commercial option would be nice, and decades would go by and nobody would listen to them.
Right.
So those are kind of always my heroes in different domains of people saying the unpopular thing. But I think also just underscoring what an inefficient model advertising is. And you see this, basically it's a private tax, because ultimately it comes out of our pockets. So it's a $700 billion a year, economy that ultimately consumers are paying for, but then we have no say over how it's spent or what culture it supports. And of course, it supports culture that is, not politically offensive, and it supports reporting that isn't going to go against the interests of advertisers and stuff. So I think just saying, this is the model we're stuck in, but it's totally inefficient, it's ridiculous. And that also, as an activist, I think it's really important to underscore that there are social costs too. It's not just that it's annoying to us as artists to have to beg for support from corporate sponsors, but the the way that data collection works online, these dossiers that are compiled on all of us are segmented in such a way that they open all of these new avenues for discrimination. So pricing discrimination of goods. I'm really interested in predatory lending and debt and credit, obviously, through my work with Occupy. So, you know, you can see that people are predictable populations based on race and, you know, are basically being redlined because lenders can infer things that they wouldn't be able to just ask directly on a credit report. So there are all of these negative social costs of advertising too. It's not just like an aesthetic. It's just an aesthetic problem.
I hope I'm not embarrassing you. I just want to read one more quote from your book at the end of this chapter. Advertising, after all, doesn't feed or house us or educate us or enlighten us or make our lives better or more beautiful. Instead, advertising makes our culture less spirited and fearless, more servile and uninspired. Surely all that money could be better spent producing something we actually care about. I always think of, I read this years ago in an old issue of The Baffler, I think. I believe it's in Singapore. It's, there's a country referenced in this essay talking about how so little investment has been made in the arts in this culture that, like, there's a national newspaper there that finally axed its arts and entertainment section and replaced it with a column on business management theory, and how I think the author was just talking about how, like, that's totally a direction that we're working in this country too. Like, people just see the arts as this superfluous entertainment pastime at best. It's like a recreation, but it's actually such a vital role in society for exploring ideas and entertaining new ideas about reform, I think, that aren't necessarily finding a direct path in policy or something else.
Right, and that's part of the threat of having it be robust and independent, is that the arts, you know, should be threatening and shouldn't be having to answer to the dictates of merchandising or whatever. So how do you foster that independence? And there's an idea, you know, that basically, you know, I quibble with this idea that the answer is that kind of like penury and having no resources creates better, more, you know, adventurous art. And I was like, well, there's some truth in that, but it becomes kind of obscene when it's invoked by people who are running these, like, massive online platforms that are making billions of dollars off of free content. Like,
and when you're just making more work for yourself by having to, like, yes, it's a great skill to have if you're thinking creatively about how to make the most of, like, the little resources that you have. But, like, wouldn't it be great if you could just be thinking in broader terms, like broader than the confines that you have? It's wild to me that other industries don't have to, well, perhaps they do, but I think a lot of it, we were talking in the back about, like, no one questions that a doctor should be paid, no one questions that a plumber should be paid. This is something that we've all deemed as a service. But there are still so many of us, even artists themselves, who claim that, like, you shouldn't be paid for your art, you shouldn't be paid for these things that you're doing. And I think that really devalues the work of people who are not just creating blank content, but, like, who are exchanging ideas.